Walking in the clouds.
Toy Story.
Yes. It's my favorite background to use.
Some of my students on Google Meets like to play with their backgrounds, but the problem is if they're working on something and I ask them to show me the work, it gets lost in the projection. So
Yeah,
there's
weird stuff.
Okay, now you're in Kansas or Eastern Oregon.
Eastern Oregon, actually, where I archery hunt. So
Awesome.
yes, I actually have this hanging in my office.
Archery hunting, very cool.
Yes, yes.
Fellow archery hunter. That's excellent.
Isn't Chief Greenway an archery hunter?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Spend a fair amount of
and I
Montana
archery
time.
hunt together.
Huh?
Great. We usually spend at least a couple weeks in Montana every year. So it's great.
What part of Montana?
Well, all over really. The northeast, far east, and then kind of southwest, depending on what we're going after. But,
Jin and I moved here from central Montana,
Okay.
60 miles east of Great Falls.
okay.
Yeah, beautiful country, beautiful. Okay, it's time, I guess.
Mom's side of the family's from Webo or Glendive.
Oh, yeah.
Far east.
All right. Well, hey, we got enough to start this meeting. So, and it is 6 o'clock.
It is.
Matt, do you have us recording?
Yeah, you're live on YouTube and recording. And Jacob, I do set you up as a co-host.
Great, thank you.
Great. All right. Call this public hearing to order. Wednesday, April 7th, time is 6 p.m. I will turn it over. The topic is amendments to the St. Helens Community Development Code. I'll turn it over to our city planner, Jacob Grayson.
Thank you, Mayor Scholl. So we have some formalities to start with, so bear with me. This is a legislative land use hearing. The subject of this hearing are amendments to the St. Helens Community Development Code. The applicant is the city of St. Helens. Because legislative proceedings require the observance of certain procedural formalities, the council must take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters and required statements. Does any member of the council wish to declare a conflict of interest or bias in this matter? Don't see any. And does anyone in the audience want to object to the ability of the council to make a fair decision? I don't think we have any citizens out there. So the rules for the conduct of the hearing are set forth in our policies. Generally, the order of the proceeding will be as follows: required statements, which I'm doing now, staff report presentation, and then testimony from those in favor, those opposed, and those neutral as well. Any rebuttal by the applicant, close of the hearing, close of the record, and deliberations and decision. Following statements are required to be made at the commencement of the hearing. The standards for decision by the council shall be based on St. Helens Municipal Code, section 17.20.120, subsection 1. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the applicable standards as listed, or other criteria in the code or plan which the person believes applies to the decision. So with that stuff out of the way, we can get going. Now, I have a lot of details to cover, and what I'm going to ask for is no questions until the end of the presentation, and I'm going to divide it into sections. And after each section, I'm going to pause for roughly 15-20 seconds for you to collect your thoughts and write any questions down on that section that we covered. That way we don't start talking about a bunch of other things, then you forget your questions, and then we can try to efficiently address any questions at the end. I should point, point out that Sean Edging is with us too. He is with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, otherwise the state of Oregon, to help us with any state questions or any House Bill 2001 questions that we may have. So once we get to that point, we'll have him to help us. And of course, citizens will have an opportunity to speak if any show up as well. And ultimately, my goal, because there's a lot to take in here, is to be able for you at deliberations at the regular session to be able to say, you know, your motion is recommended by staff. And then if there's any variation, you know, then we can talk about that. But you're going to see me talk about recommendations. And if you're cool with everything that we talk about, the motion will be simple as that. So let me share my screen and we'll get going on this. Okay, so you should all be able to see the city logo and some title on a tan background. So, and some of you have heard this presentation, at least portions of it, a few times. Thankfully, this is the last public hearing we anticipate, so you won't have to hear it again for a third or fourth time for some of you. But I do appreciate you bearing with us as we've dealt with this for the last several months. So first of all, what is the development code? The development code is the code that regulates development. That's where your zoning comes from, and it covers everything from a single family dwelling to an apartment complex to a grocery store to a large industrial factory. And the adoption process differs when you're amending the development code, because we have a process we have to go through the state. So they look at it to make sure we're playing ball correctly with their stuff. So there's a little more involved there. And there's two basic things we can think about as far as what are these codes dealing with. We're dealing with Oregon House Bill 2001. And then this term we like to call housekeeping, which is just a bunch of other miscellaneous stuff thrown in, given the effort that we're undertaking to amend the code. So the emphasis on these amendments are duplexes, or 2 units. And House Bill 2001 is requiring us to look at that. We're a medium city as defined by that bill because we're between 10 and 25,000 in people, and we're required to allow duplexes anywhere we allow single family dwellings. We're required to do it by June 30th. If things get adopted tonight, we'll be about 25 days ahead of that time frame. And this basically means the end of single family zoning in St. Helens. Now, our housing needs analysis talked about duplexes as well. And so, you know, that's good. We're following our own plans. Our housing needs analysis also asks us to look at annexations and cottage clusters. And that's something that we'll take a look at later on too. Sometime in the future, we'll probably also look at multifamily development as a best practice, although there's no state or local mandate to do so. But tonight, it's duplexes and some other random stuff. So this is a map that I've showed you many times, cities and counties affected by the House bill, at least in this first wave. And I always mention how little old St. Helens is up here all alone in the 3-county area of Clatsop, Columbia, and Tillamook counties. Now, when a city hits one of these population thresholds, like Astoria is pretty soon, they're on the verge of 10,000 people, then they will have to adopt these laws too. So we're kind of the first people in the Tri-County area to have to do that, but some other people are going to follow. If you're disheartened by these duplex rules, this map can show you communities you can move to that are not mandated by them. And another thing to mention is that CC&Rs is a private contract, and the older CC&Rs that prohibit duplexes or a second unit on a lot would still apply, although the city does not enforce those. So that's going to be up to a functional homeowners association to do that. One of the things that we talk about a lot with this House bill, and really in housing general, is what we term the missing middle. And that's just a term that talks about housing types in between your very common, ever so present detached single family dwelling and your large apartment complexes. So everything in between. And as a medium city, our focus, or at least our mandated focus, is duplex. If we were greater than 25,000, we would have all this stuff to worry about too, although our code allows most of this already. Now, when we talk about single family dwelling lots and zoning, we can go back to Los Angeles and New York about 100 years ago. They created some of the first residential zonings in the country. By 2019, 75% of residential land in the country was for detached single family dwellings only, according to the New York Times. And a lot of land use and other housing professionals have seen that as a problem, especially as we face housing issues at a nationwide level. And we're really part of this first wave of change where we're, well, goodbye single family zoning. Minneapolis was the first community to start that in 2018. But Oregon, with this House Bill 2011, 2019 was right behind their coattails. So we're part of this first wave. So that is the first section. And public comments, we did get some public comments. Not a lot of people jumping for joy over this, but I think most understand that it is being, we're compelled to do this by the state. Jenny and I received about 17 phone calls, and then we have about 7 letters from, or emails from citizens as part of the staff report. And so that's about 24 responses, and we sent out about 4,000 letters, which is a response rate of 0.6%, which I just thought was interesting. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to write down any questions you may have, and then we'll start on our next section. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the wonderful world of zoning. So here's our official zoning map. And just what I want to mention here is observe these colors, this graded color from yellow to brown. These are our residential zonings. And we're also dealing with some of our mixed use zones like Holton Business District here. And just to, so you have an idea of where these things are at. And these colors will match some tables coming up too, if you really want to nerd out on this stuff. Now, if we look at all the properties that we've sent notice to alert them of these changes, you can see that it's a substantial area of the city that are all blacked out here. So all these people were given notice to both inform them and comply with state laws about notifying people of zone changes that may affect their property. And we know that not everybody looks at aerial, or excuse me, zoning maps all the time. So I just wanted to have this aerial photo for context, just to show you, yeah, this map isn't made up. It's based on something that is real. So that is what the city looks like from afar. All right, so let's look at all of the residential uses possible and all of the zoning districts. And there's 2 rows we need to focus on. One is a side note, attached single family dwellings, and that's dwellings that are attached together, and at the attachment there's a property line. And so you're purchasing everything within that property, but you have a shared wall. And one of the things we're doing is in the mobile home residential zone. There's not a lot of that in town. In fact, let me show you where that's at. You have the Crestwood Mobile Home Park here, and then you have this 2/3 of a vacant property here that's mobile home residential. So we don't have a lot of it in the city, and really that's the area that's supposed to be a little more geared for manufactured homes. And attached single family dwelling lots would not be eligible for manufactured homes. And so right now they're conditionally permitted, which means you need a special permit. We're proposing to disallow them in the zoning district, and we haven't received any comments on that. But as we mentioned at the beginning, duplexes are the big thing that we're trying to cover. And there's the line we're looking at there. If we look at it a little more closer, so here's where we're at now. Duplexes are not allowed in our lowest density R10 district, and they require a special permit in the R7 and mobile home residential zone district. So we need to change that no or conditional yes to permitted. So that's one of the things that we are doing with these amendments. Now, just some interesting things. Here's a zoning map from 1958. And look at this category here, 2-family residential. So that's this unshaded area. And of course, city limits was a lot smaller back in 58. But look at how much of two-family zoning there is in the city. In fact, if we look at some memoranda from the University of Oregon from 1959, they tell us that the St. Helens first adopted zoning in 1953 and was the first entity in the county to do so. And at that time, 2-family dwellings were permitted in nearly all parts of the city, as I showed you. But interestingly, less than 2%, at least back then, contained 2-family dwellings. And this emphasizes that these changes are not going to result in duplexes or 2 detached single-family dwellings, as we'll talk about soon, popping up overnight. So the fire and brimstone will not rain upon us, at least not immediately. This is something that's going to happen gradually over time. So that was zoning. Public comments, again, not a lot of jumping for joy, but not a lot of torches and pitchforks shown at us. So I'm going to give you a little bit to collect your thoughts, write any questions down for our next section. Okay. So one of the things that we talked about pretty early on is, do we allow the conventional duplex, which is 2 units in 1 building, or do we just allow 2 detached units? And early on, the council was, well, why not 2 detached units? And so that's where we have gone, and nobody has thrown a big fit over that, fortunately. Interestingly, back in February, we had a call with the LCD, and they did a poll of medium cities that were on the call. And at least for the people present, 5 out of the 15 communities were opting for this detached approach. So I believe we are in the minority for that. So kudos for the council for kind of thinking outside the box on that one. And this means that we don't need our explicit auxiliary dwelling unit rules, because if we're going to allow a second detached unit that's not subject to size standards and stuff like the ADU rules are, what's the point in having them? So it really releases a lot of barriers to having that second detached unit. Now, if we are talking about 2 detached units on a lot, that makes us have to think about some other things. And one of the things that we talked about were requirements for distances between buildings. And this is something that the Planning Commission thought made a lot of sense, that we should have a standard We created this tiered system. So the distance requirement changes based on the zoning district. And one of their comments was if you only had 3 feet, and that's one of the things we talked about, it would look horrible. So there's kind of an aesthetic component to it as well. So for example, R10 has 10, R7 would be 7, and then R5 and our apartment residential AR would be 6. And what this diagram is supposed to show, what we did is each zoning district has a minimum depth and a minimum width, and then a minimum lot size. And so what we did is we took the lot based on its minimum depth and width, both cases, and then showed the building envelope. So these are the setback or yard requirements of the zoning district, and then included this building separation to see what kind of size of two detached structures we could get on there, and just to make sure that our rules made sense with each other. In the case of R10, we can get up to just about the 40% rule. I should add, one of the changes we're proposing is increasing the lot coverage allowed on lots of buildings and structures from 35 to 40%, where it is 35%. So that is an increase. And all these things I'm showing you are based on that proposed increase. So R10, it all seemed to work. R7, the same, we can get to that 40% and still even have some wiggle room in this case. In our R5 zoning district, same thing. Now, when we look at apartment residential, you noticed how there's this proposed, oh, what's going on there? So we're playing with our apartment residential zoning standards a little bit more. For a single house, currently the minimum lot size is 3,050 square feet with a lot width of 30 feet. For a duplex, it's 5,000 square feet in size and a 50-foot lot width. And so when we worked with the Planning Commission on this, they felt that meeting in the middle made sense for single-family dwellings and duplexes. And that's why the proposed is 4,000 square feet with a 40-foot width. And in that case, you can get pretty close to that that higher coverage. Which is 50% in this zoning district. So it's already 50%, we don't need to go higher. Now, if you look at the current apartment residential zoning, it was really hard to even break 45%. And even if you kind of, now all these are scaled with each other. And so this just gives you an idea, a good comparison. And just kind of visually looking at it, this the existing apartment residential versus the proposed, it seems a little off proportion from the others. And that's not scientific at all, but that's another kind of reason why it makes sense for us. Now, because we're talking about more duplexes, more potential for 2 units on a lot, chances are much more probable we're going to have 2 faces to a building. And so we have to look at our corner lots as exemplified here. And so one of the things we did was we looked at our rules that allow encroachment into setbacks. So let me frame what's going on here. This is a kind of a larger lot. You have 2 detached homes on there, and this dashed line represents the setbacks. Because it's a corner lot, frequently the side along the flanking street is larger than the side facing the next property. And so you can kind of see that difference there. And then that's the front and that's the back. And basically what we're doing is there are allowances for porches and such in the front yard. And we're proposing to allow that into the exterior side yard as well. And then in between the buildings, we're saying that stairs and landings are allowed within that yard as well, because sometimes you have topography, which is challenging for access. So we're loosening up those rules because of these circumstances. Now, I intentionally put this little shed in there. Sheds that are too small to require permit, and we're talking about residential sheds, not commercial industrial. So under 200 square feet or at 200, one of those, it's not big enough to require permit, and we have exemptions from some of the setback rules in those circumstances. So if this was larger than 200 square feet, it would be required to comply with, you know, the side yard, the rear yard, between buildings, all that stuff. But when it's under, it doesn't. But we do have a no closer than 3 foot rule that already applies to the property line, and that would apply between buildings as well. Now, we did have some public testimony on this matter, and that convinced the Planning Commission to increase the encroachment to 4 feet. Currently, for example, let's say this was a porch, it could go into that setback 3 feet. They said, well, let's increase it to 4 feet. And that makes sense because there's a lot of kind of releasing of some of the rules here and there, and that is commensurate with that. So we talked about the public comments, the Planning Commission's recommendation from 3 to 4. That would be part of the recommendation by staff at deliberations if you get to that point. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to contemplate, collect your thoughts, and write any questions down. Okay, so next we're going to talk about parking. Everybody loves this subject matter. So this is an image from the 1950s. And I wanted to put an old image on here just to kind of reflect on the evolution of things. If you go to 1910, 1900, managing cars wasn't such a big deal. But you did have horses, you did have horse manure, horse rings. So you had different modes of transportation that resulted in different challenges. Right now, the passenger automobile is a key feature of most people's lives, and that so parking and such matters. Now, personal mobility is apt to change, especially as technology increases at a rapidly increasing rate. So, you know, a few decades from now, we may be laughing about how we had all these parking standards, but right now it is still germane. And politics and complaints are now. The mayor position is 2 years, a council term is 4 years. And so there's kind of that balance of looking to the future, but not creating too much havoc in the meantime. So let's talk about numbers. Generally, a dwelling unit is required to have 2 spaces. That's our current rules. So a duplex, if you came in today, said, I want to build a duplex, we'd say, well, you need 4 spaces. And that's changing. So with this House Bill 2001, we cannot require more than 2. We could require 1, we could require 0. Based on all the discussions we've had, everybody agreed to go with 2, which isn't a surprise. And that's what we're stuck with. We can't require more than that. So let's talk about how. We talked about quantity of parking. Now, how does it all manifest? So here we have a lot, a driveway, and imagine then there's a garage here. Now, 2 cars in the garage, yeah, that would meet the requirement based on our current rules, which make sure each space has its own access, independent access to the street. Now, in this case, let's say there wasn't a garage here. We cover this up, and you just had 2 spaces in the driveway. Still works, great. But this, based on current rules, this doesn't count as 3 or 4 spaces if there was a space there. And we're improving some of the language about independent function in the code just to make it clearer for people. Because right now it's based on the accessibility to a street, which is a little harder reading for most folks. So we want to make things clear. That's a part of improving the code. So on this slide, we look at tandem parking, or one in front of the other. And currently, this would not count as 2 spaces. And we actually put this in the letter that we sent to everybody as a specific question, just to kind of get some feedback, which there wasn't a lot of positive feedback. And there is a recommendation to consider. We'll be talking about that shortly. But the pros to allowing tandem parking is it helps reduce your construction costs. There's less impervious area. So less impervious area means less stormwater to manage, especially over the course of many lots. That can add up. You can have a bigger yard. Maybe it'll motivate less cars, which may result in less greenhouse gas effects. The cons are you could have a big mess, a lot of complaints about, you get a call, hey, you have this parking problem. What are you going to do about it, council? That kind of stuff. We don't have a very robust transit system currently. And so, it's one of those juggling acts. But we'll talk about this more here. And just to explain a little bit more, if you had a single car garage and a single width driveway, and you needed to have 2 spaces based on current rules, you could do something like this. So each car can get to the street without another one moving out of the way. Now, as we talk about driveways, I want you to understand some basic anatomy as we talk about this. So in this case, you notice this flat area here that's at grade with the street, and that's where your car would normally drive, and that's what we typically call the throat of the driveway. And then the portion that leads up to the normal height of the driveway, that's what we call the wing. So the throat and the wing. And those matter when we look at some lot concepts. Here's a crude drawing I put together just to kind of explore, well, when should we allow tandem parking? Now, if we have a 40-foot wide lot and we have an 18-foot wide driveway, which is what we would need for 2 spaces side by side, there's still ample room for a parking space. And, driveways will a lot of times not be this evenly distributed, but just to kind of show you what we're talking about. And especially if we compare that to this next slide where we have narrower lots, 25 feet in wide. So if the 18-foot driveway approach was forced, oh man, well, there's not a lot of room for the wings here, and not much room for parking either. And that's a problem. Because the wing that we talked about has a maximum grade of 8% for disabled person purposes, and the flat area in between, this would have to be 4 feet. So you'd have the wing, the flat area, and then another wing. There's no way in heck you're going to end up with that. And so in this scenario, you'd have to deal with one big, huge driveway approach, which may not be the best for your non-motorized users. There may be a higher level of stress for people who want to use the sidewalk because they don't have a standard curb to give them that feeling of protection. Now, under the same scenario on the south side here, if you had a 10-foot, which is the minimum width for a driveway, you have a little bit more opportunity for on-street parking as well as for driveways to be shared. And so that's one of the things folded into some of the recommendations we're going to be talking about. So let's look at some examples to help think about this a little bit more. Now, this is in a subdivision in a previous jurisdiction that I worked for. And although that was well over 15 years ago, I remember the first time I walked in there for some inspections and just being like, holy cow. And it stuck with me. And so now I'm using it in this presentation. So these lots are about 40 feet wide, and the street width is only 20 feet wide. And 20 feet is the absolute minimum for fire access, and you would normally not allow on-street parking. And I don't think on-street parking is allowed here, but you see it. You see it in several places. Now, with this development, there was some shared community parking, so to speak, included with it here. But then what's this? It looks like it could be that shared parking, but if you look closer, you can see these little dots. Those are bollards, and those are bollards here. This is actually a secondary emergency access into this property. And we'll be looking at another view here pretty shortly. Another thing I want to point out is, when you don't have a lot of room to work with, sometimes people are creative. And if you block your own driveway, well, you're probably not going to call the police on it. So that's a creative way that this person, I'm assuming this is their vehicle, are using to maximize the area they have for their vehicles. And ideally, everybody would be able to get the home and property that they want and need. But especially the way things are nowadays, people get what they can afford and find. So you could have a hot rodder buy one of these lots, and that may not mix so well. This next picture is standing roughly here, looking that way. So you'll see this house and then this area here. Now look at this. See that's a red curb. That means no parking fire lane. And you have a good 6 vehicles right here in the way in the event that this entry is blocked and something needs to get through here. So, the effort here was to reduce cars, but it doesn't seem to have worked too well. Now let's look at a local example. This is Greystone Estates. These are very new houses. You can see I just took this photo less than a month ago. And this is kind of the situation that we dealt with. These are attached single-family dwelling lots. A lot of the lots are around 36, 37 feet wide, and these two are attached. But this is that example where, well, we have to have that 18-foot wide driveway, and you end up with these larger driveway approaches. And something to point out, these streets are wide enough for on-street parking. So ideally, you want to be able to utilize that, which will help reduce traffic speeds, and it gives you use of this impervious surface that's out there. So public comments, not a lot of love for the tandem parking. Most people were like, are you crazy? I mean, people did say it like that. I'm paraphrasing. We did have a little bit of acknowledgement of their benefits. So what are our recommendations for parking flexibility? The mayor and the council asked us to come back with some flexibility options for parking. And so we have 2 things as part of the recommendation. One is, so as I mentioned, our normal width here would be 18 feet. So one of the things we're proposing is to, in the case of single family dwellings and duplexes, to allow, when 2 spaces are side by side like this, to allow the improved area to only be 16 feet in width. And so that would be about the width of this garage door. And in that case, the paved width could be reduced by about a foot on either side. And that would also reduce the width of the driveway throat here. And the way we have it worded is that you would still need an 18 by 18 foot area that's unobstructed for the opening of doors and stuff like that. But the improved area would only need to be 16 feet. And that'll help reduce impervious area, as I mentioned, over time. It'll reduce costs a little bit. But with two spaces side by side, that should still be enough to get 2 vehicles on there. Because even the biggest vehicles, such as a 2020 Ford 350 4x4 crew cab, is under 8, or actually under 7 feet wide. And that's the more extreme width. The typical width for a vehicle or a car is 6 to 6.5. So that's one of the flexibilities that we're recommending. And then the other one is, when do we allow tandem parking? And when we talked with the commission, now mind you, this was after more than 4 hours of public hearings, so I could have possibly said anything. Okay, commission, do you recommend that pink elephants will fly tomorrow? They would have said, yes, just end the meeting. So that's my disclaimer. But they did recommend to consider tandem when lots are 40 feet wide or less. And if you read my report, because this is something I've been kind of bouncing around in my head for some time, and my recommendation now, which differs from what I put in the report, would be lots that are 39 feet in width or less are eligible for the tandem parking. And the reason I chose 39, sometimes when lots are surveyed, so let's say, you know, you have a row of 40-foot lots, the survey will come out as 39.9997. And if we have that 1 foot buffer, it just takes that argument, because, you know, if it's 39.9997, is it really less than 40 feet? So that's why I'm proposing 39 feet or less. It just takes that argument out of it, still meets the intent of what you're trying to achieve. And that provides that option when you have narrow lots, like in this case, to hopefully allow a little bit more use of the street, and to eliminate some of those huge driveway approaches, which may not be as pedestrian and non-motorized mobility friendly. And the other catches with that would be, it can only count as 2 spaces. You can't say, well, 4 spaces is grandfathered. Not eligible on flag lots, and I should show you what a flag lot is, just so you kind of know what I'm talking about there. So I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. Yeah, there, you can see it right here. So a flag lot is a lot that has a narrow portion that goes to the street, which is way up here, and then it widens to the area that you build on. Doesn't make sense to have those for flag lots. So those are the flexibilities that we recommend. And that is our opportunity to think and write down some questions. Okay, so let's talk about street standards. This is our transportation systems plan map, and it shows our street classification hierarchy. We have arterials and collectors and such. And the purpose of the hierarchy is we have different standards based on the street type. Arterials are meant for through travel generally, and your local streets are meant for access. So driveways are allowed more frequently and with less restrictions on local streets compared to arterial streets. And with the different classes and streets, we have different right-of-way widths. This map shows a few different types. You have the 60-footer here, which is a collector. You have a 50, which is your standard local street. And then you have these narrow ones, this 40-foot right-of-way. And that's what we're going to be picking on with these amendments. These are allowed under certain circumstances, maximum amount of units that use it and such. And the reason we have those different widths is each type has a certain array of amenities contemplated within. So 60 feet, you have sidewalk, landscape strip, travel lanes, bike lanes, all that stuff. On your normal 50-footer, you have a 34-foot pavement width for two-way travel, parking on both sides, and sidewalks. As I mentioned, we're picking on our skinny streets, and there's two versions right now. There's this 26 paved road version, and then this 20-foot paved road version that has no on-street parking. This one's based on the fire district standard of a road that's 20-foot wide with a 6-foot parking stall. And that 6-foot, that's pretty, well, it's really narrow. And you know, if I talked about some vehicles being more than 6 feet wide. In fact, the average for a passenger vehicle can be 6.5. And we know this area likes trucks, and that 224 F350 is close to 7 feet wide. So what we propose to do is get rid of the one that doesn't require any on-street parking, and it doesn't use the full 40-foot anyways. And then we're taking this one here and we're saying, okay, well, that's fine, but we want to increase the pavement width by 2 feet. So we have 8 feet for parking on one side. And so that's the recommendation on the streets. We did have some public testimony. We proposed to reduce the amount of lots that could utilize a skinny street. Right now it's about 20, and we talked about reducing it to 10. We had some testimony that opposed that, and the planning commission felt we should stay the same and no issue with staff. And so part of the recommendation is to stay the same, not go to 10 lots, which was originally proposed. So I just want to give you a little bit of time for your thoughts before we move on to the next section. Okay, so our next topic is number of driveways allowed. So I'm going to show you some scenarios so you can understand where we're at now and where we're going. So in this case, one driveway for a single lot, that's allowed now, no change proposed. Well, what about two driveways for one lot? Not really allowed now. We're proposing to allow this when a property abuts a street with no on-street parking on either side. Now, spacing standards will still matter. So if this was an arterial street, typically you couldn't have two right by each other like that. And we do have a lot of lots with two driveways. Those are typically grandfathered. And one of the reasons we kind of looked at this, I think the rules were overly aggressive when they were adopted back in 2011. And when we look at streets like Du Bois, which is this narrow street here, you know, it was created a long time ago before the city had many standards. You have this 20-foot wide road, no parking right there. You know, you want more driveways on a street like this so people have the capacity to get vehicles and stuff off the road. And why wouldn't you want properties to have two driveways in this case? And so this is one of the reasons why we thought, well, it makes sense to kind of soften up on that in some cases. Now for attached single family dwelling, it's still one access per lot. On a corner lot, currently, a duplex can have a driveway, one on each street. We're proposing that any lot developed as a duplex or a single family dwelling can have one on each street, subject to the other standards still. Public comments on this, we really didn't get any that I recall, so there's really no changes to the original recommendations, and I'll give you just a little bit of time to think about that, write any questions you may have about number of driveways allowed. Okay, so other stuff. Whenever we do code amendments, it takes time. So we like to kind of grab other things in the code that should have been amended long ago. And there's a variety of things in there that we've talked with the council about before, which aren't really controversial. So I'm not going to get into those for the sake of time. And, you know, if you want to know more about them, I can talk about them. But one thing that did come up was our scenic resource review rules. And so what the heck is that? What is this planner talking about? Okay, so in certain areas of town, and as shown on this map, really lots that abut certain streets, we have this provision in our code, which is pretty unique to St. Helens. It's not very common for communities to have these kind of rules, but it says that if you develop any structure more than 15 feet in height or more than 1 story, we have this process where a neighbor can challenge the development if they believe it'll obstruct more than 50% of their view of the river. And sometimes it actually works. We had one recently where it worked like clockwork. And you know, it's been kind of controversial at times. And our original proposal was to put in this riverway right here. But let me do a little bit of history on this. So these rules originated in 1978, and the streets that are listed in our code now are the same exact listings as they were in 78. So no change since the inception of that. Our comprehensive plan talks about public views. It doesn't talk about preserving private views. And so that's something we've always kind of been like, well, this is weird. Is it right to have these rules in our code? But as I've kind of thought about it over the years, what this law does is it helps spread the love. It helps spread the love of the view of the river, which one could put 2 and 2 together and say that helps spread the wealth, because a view helps with your land value. So it helps spread that property value and prevents monopolization of the river view. Equality is a public good. And so in a sense, it does meet our comprehensive plan. Now, some may argue about that. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, but in a sense, because it spreads the love, there is a public good there. So anyways, back in 2013, so this has been a note in my code book for, 8 years. We had some stuff on this riverway here, and I remember thinking, well, this is stupid. Why isn't this street listed in there? And, well, first of all, it has the word river in it, right? And you can see the river from all these lots. And so, that was a note that I picked up, put in the code. There was some testimony about expanding the area and if that was appropriate. But then we did have some testimony that supported it. Despite that, the Planning Commission still recommended including it in these amendments. And it's been listed since the very beginning, before we even started the public process. So it's not something we just threw in there. Another thing, though, that came up after I had a conversation with a citizen was the street listed in the code just says River Street. It doesn't say North and South River Street. And so for clarification, we're also proposing to put north and south, not just River Street. So I know that was a lot just for this, but because it created some interesting discussion at the Planning Commission, I just wanted to make sure we covered that a little bit more. So the recommendation is to include Riverway as originally proposed, and then just make sure not just River Streets labeled, but north and south. So yay, that concludes the presentation on the code amendments, but this party is not over. Because House Bill 2001 requires us to talk about other means of improving middle housing affordability. Now, this does not require us to do anything other than talk about it. So technically, we could all talk like we're chickens with no meaning, and we would be complying with the law. I don't think that's the state's intent, however. They're trying to get us to actually have a meaningful discussion, not act like animals, as fun as that would be. Now, I would like to talk about some of the stuff that our proposed amendments do to help with housing. It makes auxiliary dwelling units easier. We're increasing the lot coverage. We're expanding the yard encroachments. Some relief for side-by-side parking. There's the tandem parking, increasing driveway options. And we also have some provisions that make it easier to convert accessory structures, sheds and stuff like that to a second dwelling. So there's a lot of stuff in the code to help with flexibility on this. Although in this case, they're talking about system development charges, property tax exemptions, and a construction tax that you would tax the non-affordable housing people to help the affordable housing people. So the non-code stuff that we do now is we do have system development charge payment plans. We allow shared water meters for duplexes and two detached dwellings on a lot, which our system development charges are based on meter size, and so that's a substantial savings. We have waived some local fees for Habitat for Humanity, for example, the sidewalk fee. And then we reserved sale of surplus property to affordable housing entities. So we haven't turned a blind eye to it, but we're supposed to have this discussion. Now, the Planning Commission talked about this, and their concern was focused on historic areas. Their fear was that people would, oh, we can build all these units. We don't need these old buildings. And they're just concerned that it could result in a bunch of loss of older buildings. And what was discussed was the downtown St. Helens Historic District, which is outlined on this map here. These little stars represent the official historic landmarks or the official historic buildings for the city. And so those have some rules that apply, but a lot of these other lots do not. And so really for that, it's kind of the historic preservation angle of inventorying. What do you have? What should we look at, including on our, what we call our local landmarks register, and creating incentives such as grant programs for historic buildings. So people, want to get on the list. They're not like, hell no, we won't go. So that's kind of where we were with that. And maybe our good friend Sean with the LCD can expand on that as we carry on with the discussion. But that's all I have to say. Time for questions and discussion. And of course, any public testimony if there is any.
Jacob, I did notice there was a couple people that one was on the phone and wanted to allow them the ability if they were wanting to make a comment or question.
Yeah, sure. So unless you have any burning questions before we take testimony, I think we can get that testimony and then see where the questions bring us.
I am not seeing any hands raised.
So yeah, if anybody wants to provide testimony on these code amendments, raise your hand.
Particularly Jacob, or the resident on the phone's been here the whole time almost. And I don't know if they have the ability to raise their hand, so.
That is a good question.
Matt, do you want to click on them just to see?
Yeah, I've attempted to ask them to unmute and start their video, but they haven't responded.
Oh, they have a video?
They have video capabilities.
Oh, they do. Okay. All right. Okay. So, all right. I'll open it up for counselors to ask questions.
Jacob, this is a question I ask all the time. How much of this is mandated by the state till we do something?
Probably about 75% of this is mandated. But the major parts of it are like, we have to allow duplexes. We can't require more than 2 parking spaces. Some of those big ticket items are mandated. And if we did nothing, then a model code takes over and we have to follow that. And that would be a real pain that would just be a pain.
The other question is, what determines historic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, if we're talking from a bureaucratic standpoint, what makes it historic is it's gone through the process and meets all of our guidelines. So for example, it's more than 50 years old. It has a cultural or architectural significance and stuff like that. So that's, if you want to be on the formal list, you have those kind of things to go through.
What does cultural and historic, what is that a hard definition? Does the committee kind of guess at what that means?
Well, so culturally speaking, there's Henry Knight, and he is the founder of St. Helens. And so one of our historic landmarks is the Knighton House or the Knight House, whichever one of those it is. And it's interesting in appearance of itself, and based on its age, it may be a landmark as well. But let's say back in the late 1800s, we had single-wide mobile homes. It's very possible that if Knighton existed substantially in a single-wide mobile home in St. Helens, that mobile home would be culturally significant. And although it may look like a tin can, it still warrants historic landmark designation. Now, architecturally, one of the things that we have is our history of Italian stone masons because of our basalt rock. And a lot of our basalt homes and basalt structures are designated landmarks because of that history.
Okay, as I say, the Knight House is almost a mobile home because it originally started downtown and got moved out here to 4th Street. So that's a good construction mobile home. I've been to cities where old doesn't mean anything, you rip it down, but then they're 4,000 years old. That was really the question. What do we consider old?
Gotcha. And there, it's that 50-year mark. There are some exceptions if there's some exceptional cultural significance, but generally 50 years old is the guideline. And I think that comes from the feds.
Because my building is more than 50 years old, but I wouldn't dare call that historic or significant.
So yeah, it could be old, but the significant part has to count too.
Jacob, I will tell you, you and the planning commission did a very thorough job on vetting all this. It was a very good presentation, very thorough. I don't have everything that you guys talked about and discussed and your recommendations, I'm totally on board with.
Jacob, I have a clarifying question, just because I've been asked by several residents. So how will the zoning changes affect property value for residents? Will it increase, decrease, stay the same? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, and that's, property value is a finicky thing. One of the weird things that we have to do is if we believe that our changes are going to impact use and stuff, we have to send this letter that says it may change property value, but we don't know how it will. Generally, we're lightening up on regulations, which opens the opportunity to use your property to a greater degree, and typically that increases value because it has a higher use.
Right.
And so if I was going to make my best guess, I would say that the needle is going to lean towards the greater than the lesser. But remember, this is something that we're going to see implemented over time. We're changing the code, and buildings will be built by that code, and some people use the flexibilities, some won't. And so it's something that we're going to see incrementally over the course of many years. And there's a lot of things that can happen in those years. Housing demand can increase and decrease. And how much will these code amendments combine with everything else changing over time? That's hard to say. It's a good question, but a real tough one to answer.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to kind of modify the question. The guy next to me followed the code change. Does that reduce my building? Or is that not part of the equation?
Well, I mean, that could be, and that's a typical fear that, a typical single family dwelling resident fear is we're going to have a duplex next door. The renters are going to be evil. They're going to attract rodents. They're going to throw poop all over the place and reduce my property value.
No proof, though.
No, I've heard that fear. I have not seen a study where that is the case. And, and going back in time, residential areas had a lot of varying types of uses. I can't guarantee it's not going to result in a devaluation of a property because of those circumstances.
And moving forward on the discussion on the what the state asked us to do the discussion on, and not talk like chickens, by the way, would be to cottage clusters. And that's always been something I'd like you as city planner and you and Jenny to look into, is just kind of what that would look like for future development.
Yeah, no, I very much want to get that done.
Yep.
And we'll be talking about that at our planning commission, planning quarterly report this month, and kind of what we're looking at in the future.
Good. Okay, any other protocol we have to go through, Jacob?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that's the extent of the affordable housing measure conversation that you want to have. That's fine. We've talked about it. I think we met what we're supposed to. And Sean can speak up if we need to speak more on that, if he would like to.
Hey, Jacob. Yeah, and also sorry, when you introduced me, I wasn't able to actually enable my camera, so I wasn't able to kind of introduce myself. But thank you, I appreciate that. You're right. Yeah. So the statute really just says, as a city, you guys just need to consider, what do you do in terms of your system development charges related to middle housing? Do you have like a construction tax that would be used for affordable housing? And then, would you leverage property tax exemptions to kind of incentivize the development of middle housing? And, I mean, you've already considered that in kind of the outline of what you guys do. Our kind of way of taking this and making it more of a meaningful discussion is saying, well, as a state and all individual cities are now starting to give a lot more thought to, well, how are we thinking about housing types? How are we going to make housing more affordable? And that's kind of how we encourage this conversation to be used. And I think you guys are doing that. So at least from my perspective, I think you guys have met the letter in spirit of what that's trying to get at.
Okay, awesome. Great. Thanks, Sean.
And Sean is from the state, again, from the DSL, right?
DLCD.
DLCD, yes. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, Sean, he reviewed our stuff, made sure we were in line. And Sean, are we the first? No, we're the second community to be on the adoption.
That's a good question. I know the city of Prineville was the first to adopt. They actually did it before the end of 2020, and I don't think another city has finalized an adoption just yet. So you guys might be second up.
Cool.
Okay, so we will go ahead and close this public hearing.
Great, thank you.
Yep.